Hey guys, I've got a few updates with grass on different surface angles and heights. I've got dynamic light maps working, and also the terrain third texture overlays, which can fade in and fade out, plus I fixed the transparency material as well. So there's a lot of stuff in this video, so I'll just show you first, and towards the end of the video, if anyone's interested, I can show you how I edit the materials as well. Anyway, so here's a typical scene. We want a nice grass texture and terrain looking if you're going to use grass. Typically I've found the textures have a big impact on it. Like this grass texture here is actually quite good. Looks sort of realistic, and it's down low towards the ground, and not occupying, not too high up the top, because otherwise you see this X thing floating around too much. You don't want to try and reduce that as much as possible. On top of that, the default CopperCube doesn't adjust the height of the grass on different angled surfaces, so like it's just sticking out of the, literally out of the terrain. Looks terrible. Grass just doesn't do that. Ideally you'd want to change the angle to match the surface, but at least for now I've just got a system in place to remove all those problems, so it looks a bit more realistic in the source code. So with some new additions, you can change the width of the grass. The default size of the grass is by default 20 wide and 17 high. That's the default for all grass. You can change it on a individual index level, like I showed you in the previous video. All grasses occupying a texture on a particular texture index here can all be changed at once if you want to. I mean, it's actually possible to change individual pieces of grass as well. I can actually access individual indexes of the array of all the grasses. Not at the moment, but if I wanted to, I could actually do that. So by default we can change the I should add grass coverage. So these changes best work within the editor, not when your game is running, but they still some of it will still have an effect when you run during runtime as well, even if you're not able to edit it yet in the editor. So this is designed to set your grass defaults and then create your level, but they can still work. Some of it will still work even if you can't do that, because we can't do that at the moment. But during runtime it'll adjust the maximum height and maximum angle that the grass will start off in your level when you first run your game. So in other words, it'll go through all of the grass instances and just delete the ones that don't match. So max height is 50% of the total height of the whole terrain, in other words, 0.5. Between 0 and 1. Max angle between 0 and 90. I think 15 is roughly pretty good. So that's by default. It'll go through and just delete and get rid of the stuff that's inappropriate. Alright, so here's the standard source code generate grass. It seems to get run every time you open a new level anyway, because it actually runs during runtime. So anyway, what it does is it just gets rid of where the angle is higher than your grass max angle, or the height, vertical height of the grass on the terrain is higher than what you've accepted. Then it will just skip this running and then go through the for loop that way. So in other words, when I run this here level, it'll actually automatically remove all this stuff off the sides of the rocks sticking out. Just doesn't look right. It doesn't look right at all. So I just publish that. There we are. See, it's removed it automatically. Yeah, so that looks way better. It looks like, a bit more like real grass, doesn't it? So the grass is down the bottom, and it's not sticking out the side of a terrain hill. Heaps better. Anyway, that's working with my terrain sound manager as well. But anyway, yeah, so that doesn't look too bad, does it? Looks quite okay with a bit of a nice grass texture, plus the grass doesn't look half bad. The trees need work, but anyway, that's the smallest of the additions. The next one is Okay, so this is transparency finally fixed. As you'd expect, we want to just fade in and fade out the transparency from whatever it is to nothing and back again. We can totally do that now. It's totally fixed. It's beautiful. It's one of the, I don't know, simple fix, but it's one of the best useful things you could have, I think. It's dynamically changing transparency. Such an excellent feature in any game. Okay, so you can say you've got a window or something. I'll just press a button to fade out the window and fade it back in again. So that's obviously a transparent texture, so it's faded out, it'll come back in again and go out just by itself. So that works with transparent textures, but it doesn't only work with transparent textures, it works with any texture. So that texture is like it's a PNG. But you also add like a JPEG, see that? JPEG, just throw that in there, solid material, it's not transparent. Run that, you'll find it still works just as good, perfectly the same, so it's amazing actually. It's a simple little change, but it makes such a big difference because, you know, so many things I can fade in and fade out dynamically during the game using transparency. It's extremely useful. So I'll just press a button now, fade it out, and it'll fade back in again. So it works absolutely perfectly. Beautiful. Yeah, so that's an awesome addition. It was a fairly simple fix actually. Once I knew how to change the so as you can see, transparent alpha. It's adjusting a transparent alpha. I haven't yet got the transparent add to be faded in and faded out. That's a little bit more tricky. Okay, so here's the material transparent alpha channel. This is all DirectX. I only use DirectX, so my additions are only working in DirectX. I don't bother with OpenGL. It's just totally unnecessary to make fixes for things I don't use. Okay, so it uses material parameter 1, just called param here. And what I'm doing is fading the transparent material, or even if it's not transparent, it could be just totally opaque. I'm just adjusting its transparency over time. So 0 means, so in the CopperCube default is 0 in the irrelic properties. It's just always 0 here. See that parameter 1? It's always just 0. So whatever the texture does by default, I just want to keep that same thing when you run the game at 0. And then as this goes towards 1, it's a fraction. You can put whatever fraction in there you want. That'll increase the actual transparency back to fully transparent, so you can't even see it. So that's what that's doing. So that works well that way. So I've just changed given it an alpha blend texture factor, and put in a variable which is linked to the parameter material parameter there. I'll go through that in detail in the end of the video. If anyone wants to see how to edit materials. So that's pretty sweet. That's such a useful thing. I can't believe how useful that is and how simple fix. Anyway, before it had this just cutoff value that would just cut it off, sharp cutoff, which is really designed for things like plants actually. But plants cutoff have their own material already set up for it. It's particularly that one, transparent alpha reference. So that's got a cutoff, alpha reference cutoff, or there's another one as well. But I think it's actually based off this material. So anyway, terrain plants is based off a different material to just transparent alpha, so it has no effect. So it works really well actually. Very happy with that. Okay, so I'll show you the dynamic light maps now. This is a sweet little function that I make. So you just put all your stuff in there. Just put static light maps as normal. Everything as normal. You know, put your lights in, turn them on, whatever. I think it actually works even if you don't turn these lights on. That's weird, but anyway. So go to your light mapping. I usually just stick with shadows and diffuse. I usually finish off with diffuse is the main one, seems to be. Global illumination takes forever. I don't bother with that, or white. I don't usually use that. So I'll just stick with, you know, I don't usually want smooth normals. To untick that, it looks terrible when you use that. ambient lighting, not go tick, just keep all that by default, except for just don't tick smooth normals. Untick that. Color bleeding, I'm not sure what that does. I just don't use it. So I usually do the shadows, and then diffuse is how I typically go about it. So as you can see, this nice little interior hallway looks quite good, doesn't it? It's not too bad. I mean, it's not perfect, but it's not too bad. It looks like it's got a normal map, but no, there's no normal maps at all. It's all baked into the texture. That's it. Anyway, so that's done, but that won't work because the CopperCube source code is not designed for dynamic lighting with light maps. So you'll see here in the Irrelict properties what happens when you select light maps. If it was dynamic, it unticks the lighting. This here, lighting there, it just unticks it across all materials. So you want to just fix what you can manually just go through and tick them all, or I've got a nice little plug-in I'll attach to itchio. You can just go Control L and boom, every material is suddenly got lighting automatic. Could be, you know, because you might have like 30-40 materials in some cases. It just automatically adds lighting to each material, and that'll work. So notice how, okay, that's got a light map. That's got a light map. This one doesn't. This one sometimes does some weird things. One texture blend. You don't want that. If you want dynamic lighting to work properly altogether, get rid of that and put it back to light map. Don't need that there. Get rid of that. So lighting is set up, and the light map texture, just put some default thing that will look okay. I typically go with something like that, something that matches the surrounding edges. So that dark there will match this browny grey there. It actually is a match, but just change that texture to sort of get something close to. You'll be able to see when you run it anyway. So you do need that second texture there for dynamic light maps to work. So in other words, it's always looking at a texture on each one, and now. That's all we had to do. Now if we run it with the with my new compiled binaries linked to it. So I'll turn these lights off. I'll just turn them off. So they're off now by default. It's only got light maps, and I've got a thing to turn on and off a light number 2. I press the space bar, it just toggles light number 2 on and off, and also the text number 1, which is is that meant to be like that? Width. Anyway, yeah, something like that. So I'll just turn that off for now. So I'll be toggling on and off a dynamic light map. So you'll see that now. That should run Windows DirectX. So as you can see, that's pretty much exactly the same as it was in the editor. There is a slight difference. It's a little bit darker, but it's hardly noticeable. So now you can fade in and fade out the amount of the light map in the game. So like I push L and it's changing the parameter 1 value. You're fading in and fading out the actual light map itself into the scene, which is pretty cool. And on top of that, I can turn on and off. This is a point light. Admittedly, it doesn't work too good when it's really dark, but when it's bright, it adds. You notice it adds brightness to the actual light map color itself. So yeah, it totally works. It's pretty sweet. That's your dynamic point light going on and off. So there's dynamic light maps. If you, for example, attach a point light to a camera and run around the scene, it'll brighten up the screen. So yeah, so normally you probably wouldn't darken it too much anyway, black. Yeah, so that's, I mean, so you wouldn't go too dark with it, otherwise the point lights won't have too much of an effect on it. You might have to make the point lights super bright in that case to have an effect. Let me just try that. So when it's really dark, you wouldn't, I don't know what you want it so dark like black. I'm not sure you would want that, but anyway, totally lightens everything up, totally works. Has a little of, when it's really black, it doesn't have too much of an effect. So you'd probably want to just not go all the way down to pure black if you are wanting to fade in and out the light map. So that works pretty sweet. Very nice. Not only is the light map dynamic with point lights and you know, things like directional light, but it's also able to be faded in and out. So that's even better, if you ask me. So let's give it a light. Should be facing on this direction of the wall. And it is. See, that's a lot brighter on that side. That's directional lighting. And on top of that, I can add more with my point light. So it's all dynamically working together. So that's pretty nice. Yeah, so there's your dynamic light maps. That's a big improvement. Gosh. If you know, you could theoretically use unlimited number of point lights in your game, in your level, bake it all into light maps, and then fade it in and fade it out if you need to, or just leave it as it is and run around with your point lights, a torch, or put a directional light in there, whatever. Yeah, really good. Light map, here's the once again. So this is DirectX and also fixed function pipeline. So I have a tendency to keep away from shaders too much. Not that they're not able to work good. They actually can work a lot better than the fixed function pipeline, but it's just that the whole game engine by itself, CopperCube by default, is fixed function pipeline. That's what it is. All these things, irrelic properties, is all fixed function pipeline. That's what it is. All these things, making adjustments to ambient, diffuse, emissive, specular, all this stuff, the whole lot, it affects the fixed function pipeline materials. And it's only in some other materials you could probably affect them as well, the built-in materials, but it's a little bit slower. It's a lot slower, actually, I've noticed. If, for example, you're using normal maps, or if you're using shadows in your game level, that'll change the entire lighting system over to a new shader code. The fixed function pipeline won't be running. I'm not sure if it even runs at all, or runs both at the same time. I'm not sure. Really bad for performance using shadows. I don't use it. So I just use DirectX without shadows and single textures, or a second texture with light maps and things like that. I don't use normal maps. Most of the detail can be baked into the texture and still look pretty good. Like this is here. That's the normal map baked into the single texture. It's you know, it's not as good as having separate textures, but it's still pretty good. Yeah, so I like performance. I like high performance because theoretically I'm going to add a ton of stuff all working together later on. I still want good performance. So that works really nicely. And yeah, there's your light map material, and all I had to do is add in some stuff here. Pretty much those 3 lines was, I mean, there's a lot more stuff in. When you're fading things and fading out materials, there's a lot more work to be involved when the fixed function pipeline. You can do it, but it is a lot more work. I can't deny. I'll show you that later if you're interested at the end of the video. Yeah, so that's pretty sweet. That works nice. Works real good. I was almost thinking of redesigning my whole game to use just light maps only, because it's a lot faster. I can use an unlimited number of point lights and everything else all baked into the level. I mean, theoretically that's a lot better, but I'm not sure yet. But anyway, it's a nice addition. There's that one. And also, okay, here's another nice one. I've got a terrain weather system overlay. You can use it for lots of different things, really. So you got your standard, you know, whatever, pretty rough looking level. Now, like some of my APIs, they're designed to be used within the editor and then saved out that way. It's just more straightforward and simple. You can edit it and modify a lot of things that way a lot better. I fixed the terrain texture blending. It's fixed. That problem doesn't exist anymore. Whereas in the editor at the moment, it's still a bug, still a problem. So that's why. But some of the stuff can be fixed up. If you were to run before this loads, you know, so you apply my, so that looks pretty good, doesn't it? Nice textures. So if you were to apply my new API set terrain texture angle, if you were to, you can do it before start or during the game. Probably before start is really the best thing, until Nico allows us to use this in the editor. Set terrain texture angle, you've got the texture node, then you've got the first lot of angles is 0 to 22, the second one is 22 to 55, the third one is 55 to 90. So 90 is the highest angle. So that's the terrain texturing angle one. So if you were to run that before it loads the terrain or during the editor, you get something like that. So it's a nice nice little one, and notice all the blending is perfect. It's all very good. There's no issues with that now. Some nice textures there too. Those mountains look good, don't they? And then if you want to use my new, I'll call it an overlay just to make it easier to understand it, you know, because I've talked about blending. The standard terrain texturing blending is all, it's all working nicely. Looks actually not too bad, isn't it? Not too bad. We'll call it the terrain overlay. So what happens is if you've got two normal materials, you've got solid is the default material, and then where it blends between two textures at the edges, it uses a different material called two texture blend. So I've created two more materials within the source code to swap. Once you want to blend, overlay another texture from those two materials, it worked out better just to create brand new materials rather than edit the existing ones, because you don't want to stuff around the existing materials that are used by lots of other different things. Causes problems. So just use two new materials. And if I wanted to, say, blend in a snow effect or something, you know, something like this, there you go. You can see it slowly blending in between 0 and 1. I mean, this is one way to do it. This is the default simple way, I would call it. So it's actually overlaid another texture on top of the existing textures, so you can actually see it. I mean, it looks like, you know, frozen world, doesn't it? Totally frozen. The whole thing's frozen solid. Yeah, and I can just blend it back out as well. You know, you can stop and start it, set it at whatever level you want. This is just to show you that it does work. So that's one way. You can set that across the board, across all textures in your terrain, or you can select a specific texture, or you can select all textures and apply a different ratio to each level of your terrain. So that one there is applied equally to all textures. That's why it looks all the same sort of frozen look to it. I prefer another method which is a bit more sophisticated. System. So I'll show you that one that was running right there. It applies it to all textures because here it is here. Set terrain blending. There's a text terrain node. The number here, if it's above the highest number texture in your terrain setup, it'll then automatically just apply it to all the textures. It's set up so it's easier to use that way. And it's saying, okay, so normally what index texture am I using to blend with another texture? Normally it'd be like 0, 1, 2, or 3, or whatever number of textures you got. And then the blending texture is the second one. So it's, in my case, it's number 4. So I've actually got 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's 4. It's the 5th texture, but it's index number 4. That's the snow texture. So you can actually select specific textures and blend it by itself, or select each one and blend them all separately with their own setting. So that seems to be the best, most sophisticated and best looking way of doing it, if you ask me. So in other words, if I change that from 13 back to 3 and then unhide all the uncomment out the, so in other words, I'm applying a separate section, a separate amount for each of my textures. Blending textures number 4, so I'm saying give the first, second, third and fourth texture, apply adjust the parameter 1 setting, by a different ratios. So the ground level it normally works out. So if you're using my set textures according to angle, then this first texture will be the lowest one. So I've set that at 0.5, the next one up 0.6, texture number 2 0.7, and then the highest texture, the highest up in the mountains, the high area up the top, will be the maximum overlay amount. In other words, or up to 1. So these will never go to 1, they'll be a percentage of it. So in other words, I'm fading in a certain percentage in and out according to each texture. This will tend to look a bit better, a bit more sophisticated. So if I was to run that, now to get it to really look properly, not just the angle like that, I've also got another API that has a more sophisticated check that looks at both the angle and the height and applies a certain texture, so which I'm going to just run now. If I press T, look at the top of the hills, there's a slight change. It's the same texture as the one below it, but it actually is a different texture. And for this next process to work properly, it actually has to be a different texture in the code for it to distinguish as against the one below it. So I'll update my scene according to the angle, and then I'll also run this second new API I've created called set terrain texture. It's saying what index texture, in this case it's the 4th texture or index 3. I'm saying adjust according to the height, it must be 0.5 or above, between 0.5 and 1 of the height, that's in percentage terms, so 50% or above. And the angle of the surface must be between 35 and 70. I haven't gone to 90 because I mean, it looks better with some sort of adjustment like that. So I'll update the angle, then I'll update the specific texture up the top, and then when I run this, okay, so let's have a look. So we've got loaded that, change it according to the angle. Now I'll update the texture up the top. So that's applied a separate texture just to the upper areas, so that when I run the blending now, you will see that it is brighter, a much brighter white up the higher, like high mountains. You see a lot of snow up high mountains typically. Yeah, so that looks to me a lot better than the previous one where it's just a blanket ice all over the whole terrain. This looks more realistic. Doesn't look too bad, you know, for starters, put it that way. It's not high quality, but it's not too bad. I think it's alright for starters. Yeah, so obviously you can work on that and change the colours and make it stand out more and all the rest of it, but you can see what I mean. So in other words, the high up in the mountains, it's got the most amount of white snow look to it, and then it blends down from the top to the bottom all the way down. I mean, theoretically I should have more probably snow effect down the bottom here as well, but I can modify the texture that way and play with it, but you can see what I mean. So it's applying a brighter effect the higher up in the mountains, as sort of you seem to see in real life. It sort of works that way. And then also down the low areas, you can still get snow when it's flatter areas. That's typically how it works. But yeah, anyway, that's a little bit better, I think. So that's a more sophisticated. Or if you want to just update a single texture only and not do the whole scene, you can also do that. Now the inputs are, I'll just get rid of. Let's get rid of. Yep, below. First, second and third, get rid of those for now. So updating a single texture, number 3, blended with the 4th one. Now this is here this number 1 here this is the adjustment that applies to where the 2 texture blend. Only where there's 2 textures connected together, the blending of those 2 textures. If you're using a single update on one of the textures, it's better if you put 0.5 there, it'll look a lot better. If you don't, it'll have a sharp cut off between where it starts and stops, where one texture starts and another one ends. But this will sort of just blend it in a little bit better at 0.5, so you'll see that. I'll put that in here as well. So that's where it comes in, that's where it blends out. Okay, so 3, 4, and 0.5. You'd only adjust that. It's like a feathering of the blend amount of the overlay, if you like. You would only adjust that if you're updating a single texture normally. So if I now run it, it knows now to update it for just a single texture only, and not the whole lot. So okay, I've updated those top textures now. I just press T, so it does actually have a different texture up the very top. It looks the same as the one below it, but it actually is just slightly different. So when I blend the snow into the top texture, you'll see it blends in, and yeah, doesn't look too bad. I mean, and you can see the it's not perfect, of course. It's not perfect. There's no true exact proper blending with the texture overlay, the terrain texture overlay. But putting it at 0.5, at least it's better than sharp cutoff. It would be a very sharp cutoff otherwise. If I didn't, I'll show you without it. I mean, it looks a little bit weird because you can see squares on the surface. So I guess that's, you know, a little bit weird, but it's better than what else are you going to do? I suppose you could make it lower than that, make it less than 0.5. You could go like 0.4 or 0.3. It might look better, it might not. But as you can see, yeah, that's sort of interesting, isn't it? It's given a snow-capped mountains look to it. It's not too bad, actually. I don't mind that. But if you were to put 1 instead of 0.5 here, I'll show you what I mean. It'll be a sharp cutoff then, and then I think it'll look even worse if you ask me. So yeah, 341, 341. Run that. Update the angles. Update the top texture. It actually has to be a different texture than the one below it, otherwise yeah, you might find it updates the whole scene instead, so it won't work right. But anyway, so now let's blend in the snow. Yeah, see, the cutoff is a bit too sharp. Doesn't look right. So the way it was before, it was a bit better if you ask me. 0.5, you might even go 0.4. Depending on the texture you're blending into, obviously, you play around with that to get different effect, different look to it. But at the moment, it's a sharp cutoff, which I don't think that looks very good. Yeah, so in other words, the terrain texture overlay, it is good. I like it a lot. It's very good, but it doesn't have perfect blending between textures. So that's why I haven't, instead of across the board single update, I've used different amounts per texture manually. This is like a manually, for each texture I've applied a different ratio manually myself. I've tried to do it the other way with hooking into the height and the angle and making individual adjustments for every single cell or square in the whole level. Good idea, but unfortunately it didn't work out as well as I'd like. There was always sharp cutoffs. You'd see squares on the surface that didn't look quite right. So that's the constant problem. There's no true blending of the overlay with the underlying texture when it starts and stops. This way, if you do it manually, it sort of helps cover that up, so it looks a lot better. So anyway, if I put 0.4, that might look a little bit better. Yeah, I think that's probably better. Looks a little bit better than before. Anyway, so there's always going to be a little, tiny issues like that when you're using the terrain texture overlay. So instead of using it across just for a single texture, which doesn't look terrible, it's not terrible, but just, not great, it's not fantastic either. It's sort of okay. I have a tendency to just apply it across the whole level in different subsequent amounts, like I showed you before, and that way you don't really see the cutoff sections too much, like sharp lines as much. yeah, there's no real way around that, I don't think. Yeah, I mean, it's not too bad. From a distance, it looks pretty good. But close up, yeah, it needs a bit of work. Anyway, definitely usable. So use it across the whole level. You won't have any issues. Or just do it the way I showed you before and apply slightly different ratios according to different textures as you go up from the bottom to the top. And that'll help a lot as well. Yeah, so if I was to change this to, so I've only got 4 textures in, sorry, 5, it's 5 textures in total, 0 to 4. So if I was to go to 6, well, anything more than the total number of textures in the level, it'll then automatically just apply it to all the textures in the level. That's just set up that way. Makes it easier. And you wouldn't put any feathering of the edges in that case because it would be no point. It wouldn't look good. So just stick that to 1, go back to 1. No feathering of the edges. And yeah, so it'll just apply it across the board that way to the whole level. Be no squares. You won't see any squares or any issues or need for any blending whatsoever. But at the same time, it does apply it to the entire level equally, which I don't think it looks as good. But you know, it's still something. It's actually usable. See a bit of a transparent. I don't know if that texture even needs to be transparent because a lot of the time it doesn't. But anyway, I think it's a transparent texture. I'm just blending that in. That snow texture. Obviously, you could use this for so many different things. You could use this for a detail map. So, for example, you don't care about weather effects and you want to add extra detail into your whole terrain. You could use it for that as well. You could use it for a lot of things. Yeah, so that's pretty nice. Okay, so that's all that there. I hope you like that. I will now go through how I edited the fixed function pipeline materials. Yes, I know it's very old. It's old technology, but that's CopperCube. It's always going to be old technology. It's DirectX 9 still. So either you work with it or just abandon it and go elsewhere, I suppose. But anyone who's interested in making new materials in the fixed function pipeline, and DirectX specifically, because I don't bother with OpenGL. Keep watching, and I'll show you a couple of things that'll help. Okay, so the file name is Irrelic source Irrelic cd3d9 material renderer.h. There's all your fixed function pipeline materials. So here's solid material, standard solid. In case you're wondering, what's this? Modulate 4x lighting. Well, that's the standard latest update in CopperCube since quite a while ago. They increased the lighting by four times the original amount. I think because it was trying to adjust for the darkness in the lighting due to normal maps and other things like that. So it was trying to make adjustment for that. The only problem with that is no doubt was never envisaged is the problem if you're doing a day-night cycle and changing the ambient lighting. DirectX 9 has to use a whole integer number going from 0 to 255. It does not do decimal changes. So when you're using 4 times the lighting, it's usually full brightness around like 40, 45, 50, something like that. Ambient lighting, you wouldn't go above about 50 because normally that would be like 200 without the 4 times the light. So that caused a lot of problems because you'll see the light flash as it updates bit by bit if you're doing a day-night cycle that brightens and darkens. And there's a way around that. But anyway, that causes its own problems. But I actually use 2x lighting, in case you're wondering. Get around that problem. It fixes all that up. So in other words, you don't notice the jumps in the lightness, ambient brightness, as it going from 0 to 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, etc. You go all the way up to 100 now, and yeah, it's a lot better. Anyway, so the key thing to get dynamic lighting into any material is, firstly, fixed function pipeline. That's still standard. This is standard stuff. It's got up to 8 texture stages, so from 0 to 7 that you can have in fixed function pipeline, and the game engine in CopperCube source has limited the textures to 4. Theoretically, you could probably change that. I don't know why you would, but anyway, 4 textures. You shouldn't need more than that to make a material. So it does things in stages. So it does one thing for the color operations per stage and one thing for the alpha operations per stage, and then goes to the next stage. And then you can do new stuff to the existing texture in that next stage and apply it to the stuff from the previous texture if you want. So that's how it's designed, to go in stages one to the next, starting at 0. That's the first texture, and then second texture is stage number 1. So this lighting here, dynamic lighting, you'll need the modulate, or more typically modulate 4x. Then you'll need color operations, argument 1, argument 2, you'll need texture and diffuse. Those things get multiplied together to give the dynamic lighting. That's effectively dynamic lighting. Alpha operations you don't always need to do. In some materials you don't use alpha operations at all. You have to just disable it, turn it off. You have to put something in alpha in each stage, I believe, by default, even if you're not using it. Okay, so this one here is saying, okay, multiply the current texture, the first texture for solid, for example, it's saying multiply that by the diffuse lighting and don't do anything with the alpha operations for the first texture. And then in the second texture stage, doesn't need to do anything, we're done, we're finished. And you always just got to tell it what's the alpha blend enable or disable. Just by default it's always false. So this is also important. The material type, I think this gets run every frame. I think it's checking if the material has changed, the type, or reset or render states, which almost never happens, but it's like a backup. So it's checking if any of those things have changed, then go through and redo the material. So that's this is a adjustment on the solid material. I've just called it terrain 2 layer, and it uses color value and input parameter 1, which is here it's just called mirror material type param. Give it a variable name. A float usually is the best way to go. Don't use integers too often. They often cause more trouble than you believe. And something in that order. There's 2 ways to get a variable in from parameter 1 or parameter 2, either one or both if you want. This one is one way. Pick any particular texture stage, call it this constant. In the capitals it's all DirectX 9 code to work with DirectX 9. It's all standard stuff. So firstly here I am modulating, no I'm not. This one is a different one. I'm modulating the diffuse and the current. There's got a weird terminology in programming. Some things don't really make a lot of sense. But anyway, this is saying the current texture of this texture stage, number 3. That's what you would think it is, but no, it's not that. It's not talking about current. The current before this texture stage runs. I know it's weird. It shouldn't be called that, but it is. It's actually DTA current refers to the previous texture stage, which is number 2 in this case. So it's saying whatever the result of the previous texture stage number 2, multiply it, here it is there, modulate 4, by default that's what it runs with the diffuse lighting, and that gives you the final value. So in other words, you can multiply the dynamic lighting, add it towards the end of it if you want. Sometimes you do it at the start, sometimes the end, sometimes you need to mix it up, but normally, yeah, one or the other typically. Here we are. Now this is a weird one, terrain 2 layer. Now there's limitations with the fixed function pipeline. It's a bit of a pain in the butt to work with, I'm not going to lie, but you can work with it, you can understand it, it can be done, as I have done. It took me a long time to work it out originally, but anyway, once you get a handle on a few key concepts, it gets a lot easier. Color operations uses typically 1 argument or 2 arguments. If you're only using 1 argument, then you would just select, it's what this color argument for this texture stage 0, it's saying basically don't do anything, just grab me the color, just give me the color, that's it, and I'll pass it to the next stage, or the next stage will refer back to it, in other words, typically. So that's saying select argument 1, that's the operation. Otherwise, just get me the color. Don't do anything. Alpha operations for the first stage is also saying just give me the diffuse. Now, the weird thing here with this terrain 2 layer is, this is the only way I worked out how to do it, is firstly I want to get the parameter 1 input so I can blend in and blend out the texture. So I want to do that first. And then once I've done that using the alpha, so here I'm modulating the alpha of the blend texture. So terrain normally has just one texture, but terrain 2 layer for my terrain overlay material will use a second material. And so what I'm doing here is adjusting the alpha on that second texture first, and then blending that alpha into the first texture. Now, it's a weird way I've gone about it. It's the only way I knew how to do it. So firstly, I'm using the alpha in this case, modulate. So when I'm using the parameter 1 or 2 settings to multiply some value between 0 and 1, I just always use modulate as a general rule. So it's just multiplying by 1. So you're multiplying the 2 values effectively. Yeah, so you're using the current texture. DTA texture means the current texture of this texture stage, and I'm multiplying that by a constant. So that's all I've done on the alpha operations for texture stage 1. And in terms of the color operations, I'm not doing anything. I'm just getting the color. Just saying, just give me the color, and I'll use that in another time later on. Because I haven't worked out a way to both modulate and then apply that modulation to the existing texture on that texture stage at the same time. I don't think you can do it. It's typically one thing at a time. That's the limitation with these fixed function pipeline. Yes, a shader code is way better in a lot of ways. It gets around all these problems. But anyway, you work with what you got. If you want to work with the fixed function pipeline, then you've got to do this. So, all right, so this is all important. Everything's important in this fixed function pipeline. A lot of things can catch you out, but once you understand some key concepts, it becomes easier. Okay, so you normally don't need to use texture coordinate index unless you're changing the texture. Then you generally will need to, because by default it just sticks to the first texture. Texture coordinate index, like a certain way of mapping of the texture. So different textures are different mapping, believe it or not. They're not all, yeah, I don't know, somehow it's different. So you do need to tell it to change the, so this is saying use the texture coordinates from stage 0, not this current stage 2, not the texture in stage 2, use the texture coordinate index from stage 0, which is the first texture. So in other words, I want to blend the alpha component of the second texture into the first texture. And in this case, I need to refer back to the texture coordinates from the first texture to do that. Otherwise, it doesn't work properly. And I've told it here to blend the current alpha. What does that mean? It means current means not this current stage. No, that's what you would think, but no. It means the previous stage. So in other words, the previous stage, which I've got the blended, the alpha blended second texture amount, I'm now going to blend into this texture 2 on texture stage 2. But you say, but there's only 2 textures, 0 and 1. But actually, what I've had to do with this one is to get around this problem of limitation on what you can do per stage, is take a copy of this first texture, whack it into stage 2, which is actually the third texture slot, in order for that to work correctly. So you can do that, and that's how I've got around a lot of the problems. So here, when I'm setting up the blending, the terrain blending now, it looks for the solid material, and then it sets the second texture, or index 1, to the blended texture, and then also takes a copy of, see that, material get texture 0, means get the texture that's in the first texture in index 0 and add it back to here in index 2, the same copy of it, so I can use the same texture. So in other words, effectively I'm ignoring this first texture completely, but simply just grabbing a copy, dropping it into number 2, and then using that to blend with the previous stage, blend current alpha of the second texture. It's a bit of a backwards way of doing things, but this is the only way I worked out how to do it. Nothing else would work, because you just got limitations of what you can do per texture stage. But this will work just fine, there's no issues. So yeah. So this is just run once on startup on the terrain overlay blending, and doesn't run again after that until you turn it off, and then it will revert back to the original EMT solid or whatever. Yeah, so it starts with solid vertex alpha 2 texture blend, goes to my new material 3-layer vertex alpha. This was a freaking tricky one to work out, but I did actually work it out eventually, so it works fine. Yeah, and then you're updating the parameter value to the blend %, and you're changing the material. It happens so instantly, you don't notice anything, it's all good. So that's how I've got around a lot of the problems and limitations with this fixed function pipeline business, and it works just fine. So I'm saying use the texture coordinates of the first texture, blend the current alpha, which is the previous stage alpha, which is adjusted according to the parameter 1 value. And also you need this up here as well, in case you didn't know. You'll need to add that in. I'm actually not using, I used to use parameter 1 and parameter 2 before, but now I don't use parameter 2 anymore because I'm just not happy with it. So I'll get rid of that. So I only need to have, so what I was previously multiplying parameter 1 by parameter 2. Parameter 1 had the transparency blending, parameter 2 had the adjustment for the height and angle. And in theory that's should work brilliantly, and it did work, but not brilliantly. It didn't work as well as I thought. Some bug in it that's not making sense. I couldn't work out, so I've just left it. Alright, so yeah, so now I'm just working according to each texture on the terrain and blending in different amounts of the blending for each texture on the terrain. That works okay, as I showed you before. Okay, so so here we are. Has to be in this format. Alpha 1 picks up the texture, blends the constant amount, which is whatever variable you call here, which is picked up, linked back to the parameter param 1 setting of irrelic properties. You need the D word, you need that all set up there like that. Okay, so what I've done here, blend current alpha, and that works just fine. And after all that, then I've applied the dynamic lighting to the scene as well with the current, which is the result of the previous stage. So this is stage 3, looks at stage 2, the final end result of all that, applies the diffuse lighting to that, and then we're done. And then I will typically, don't always know if you need all this all the time. Hang on, there we are. Okay. Unset material. Typically, you would have the same last texture stage as the last thing it was doing, and just turn it off. Disable both the color operations and the alpha operations. Typically, that's what you do. I don't know if it's always necessary. It seems to work without it, but anyway. So I've just put that in. If you ever enable alpha blend enable, you will definitely need to, if you had that true, you'll definitely need to turn it off in this section here. Unset material has to be turned off as false. Anyway, so yeah, so that one works good. So there's the terrain 2-layer. That's that one. Bump map. I haven't really started with that yet. Anyway, vertex alpha 2 texture blend. Terrain 3-layer, yeah, that's that one. That's a tricky one, I tell you. That's a tricky one. I won't go into too much detail about that, but the light maps was a more tricky one to get it to look right. I had to first modulate the first texture with the lighting, then modulate the light map second texture as normal, and then modulate the result of those two. So hang on. Yeah, by 4 from the previous texture stage, the light map texture with temp. This case it uses DTA temp. There may be some code somewhere, I couldn't see where it was, that I suppose I could create an API to do that anyway, that changes how adds a copy of the first texture into the stage 2 or third texture slot, so then it can use that, because modulate always uses typically current or the previous texture stage with this current texture stage, which you would normally put DTA texture, which is the texture on stage 2, index 2 or stage 3, or the third texture if you like. But in this case I've just used temp, and that does work, but you can only use it once in all of your materials, it seems like. It's a very limited factor. Once you use DTA temp, the original source of that DTM, this whole texture is blocked. It's not used anywhere. Can't be used as, if I was to put DTA current anyway here to refer back to that one, no, it's like it doesn't exist anymore. It's locked in this DTA temp little variable box or something. But anyway, if you're not needing to worry about anything in here, you can still process stuff into that first texture, which is what I have. See that result argument of what I'm doing here, which is adding dynamic lighting to it, and then I'm dropping it in DTA temp. But you can't in the next texture stage refer back to DTA current, which is this one. It won't find it, just because it's in temp now, gone. Anyway, so this will work. I'm modifying temp, which is the first texture result of the first texture, with the current, which means the previous texture stage. And there you go, dynamic lighting, dynamic light maps. It was that easy. Well, it wasn't that easy. Everything here has taken me a long time to work out, but eventually I worked it out. I might just, while I'm thinking of it, I will fix that vertex layer 3 layer. That's my blending. I don't use parameter 2 anymore. I used to multiply the parameter 1 by parameter 2, and it does work, and everything was working. It's just I couldn't get the height value and the angles to be exactly consistent to what I thought when I was wanting to modify everything more specifically. Didn't quite work out well. I decided to just leave that and use the parameter 1 setting for to blend, fade it in, fade it out. That's it. Yeah. So that works. Yes. So there's a lot of basics. That's just touching the iceberg on all the stuff you can do with all these fixed function pipeline materials. But you can do a lot of stuff just with those bit of information. Solid 2 layer. Now when you're doing with transparent, when you're actually doing with true transparent materials, you'll typically use alpha blend enable. Almost always you'll just use that, and it blends whatever textures you've got to any other textures in your scene. So you wouldn't use that for the terrain, because I tried that, and what happens is you would actually see through your terrain textures to the mountains behind it, and it would look really dumb and really silly. You just don't use it unless it's transparent, a proper transparent material. You wouldn't use alpha blend enable. And if you do alpha blend enable, then there's all sorts of different source blend and destination blend. I think the destination blend is is it the original texture, or I think it's the final texture. Anyway, you can always look that up if you need to, but there's lots of different things you can use for blend 1 or inverse source color, inverse source alpha, invert, so many different variations of alpha blend enable. I don't use it that much, and when I do use blending of 2 textures, I typically don't use the alpha at all. I just use the color. So as you can see here, I'm using parameter 1 to fade in and fade out the second texture into the first texture using a variable, and that's the constant, and there's the texture. That's the current texture of stage 1, and in this case I'm using lerp, but just for some weird reason it actually works with a specifically set up that way. No other way it seems to work, only this way. I'm not using alpha blend enable, and I'm actually adjusting the color. I'm not alpha adjusting the second texture into the first texture. I'm actually adjusting the color. So, and this is the emissive material, where I'm blending the second emissive material into the first one. This is how I've done it. and it works fine actually. Somehow it knows to abandon the black color and just apply any other color into the first color, and it uses a variable to do that. Okay, so because this is blending two textures together, I want to refer the second texture back into the first texture. That's why you need to update the texture coordinates here to refer back to the first texture stage, because the first texture is the main one. And as you can see, the color I'm using, see all those 4 values, it's all varying each RGBA. That's RGBA. Red, green, blue, and alpha is the last one. If I was only adjusting the alpha, then you would just put 1, 1, 1, and then a variable name to adjust the alpha only, like this one here, see? If you are doing the alpha, which is this case, I'm using the alpha operations to modulate that particular texture. If you are doing it that way, then yeah, you would put, just give me the full color, and then just modulate or adjust the alpha value only, and then apply it that way, and that'll work. Yeah, so that's a lot of the basics actually. If you're not sure, you just copy the same format, use the other materials actually. One texture blend, that's some weird complicated, I don't really use it for anything. I wouldn't use that. So transparent alpha, pretty nice, very nice adjustment. Such a simple fix, but it makes such a big improvement. So I'm fading in using parameter 1 once again, and I'm using alpha blend enable. I'm using a texture factor. I mean, that's another way of doing it. I think it's, what's the difference between using a texture factor here with a variable or versus a constant? I don't know if there's any difference, to be honest. I think they will both work the same. That's the other way, by putting it into a constant value here, calling it DTA constant as an argument, color argument. Why couldn't I use that as an alpha argument? Probably could. I don't know if there's any difference actually, but anyway, this does work this way. Source blend, destination blend, source alpha, inverted source alpha. That's a standard format for when you're using alpha blend enable. You can change that up though, those two figures to other things. Test it out and run it and see how it works, but that's your standard way of doing it. Yeah, and very simple. All I'm doing is modulating the second texture using the texture factor on the alpha, blending it into the at the same time. This is all actually okay. So this is adjusting the alpha of the first texture. That's what your transparent alpha. It's not. There's no two textures here. You don't need it. You know. You don't need to make a copy of the first. You know. Do the alpha adjustment or the color adjustment, and then add it back in the following stage. You just do it all in the one stage, because you're just adjusting the one texture only, and all you're doing is changing the alpha value. Simple. But you have to do a lot of this stuff. Modulate the texture with the texture factor. Texture factor here is linked back to the variable, which is linked back to the parameter 1 setting in your irrelect properties, and there it is there. So yeah, simple fix, massive change, heaps better, so much better. Yeah, so there's all the adjustments. Bit of an update on how to modify the materials with DirectX 9, fixed function pipeline. Yeah, a shader is, of course, is going to be a lot more sophisticated and a lot better. It'll be a little bit slower, but that's fine actually in most cases. But I'm just not a big shader person. I suppose I could do that. I mean, Justin Case is better at shaders than me, I think. And if he wanted to put his code that he made into in JavaScript, which is quite a lot of code, with almost like a PBR materials, I think he had emissive, specular, all that sort of stuff. He could put, if he wanted to code that into the engine himself, instead of putting it into a behavior, which was a lot slower, had issues compiling and loading, it was just a lot slower for whatever reason. But if you put it into the core engine, I think that will be a lot faster. Something tells me if you ever successfully do that, that would be a big improvement to the CopperCube game engine. It's not something I'm interested in myself. I'll just stick with the fixed function pipeline for now. But yeah, if just in case wanted to do that, or someone else, feel free. That would be a big improvement. Yeah, so if you're going to have any adjustments with parameter 1 or parameter 2 variable coming in to these fixed function pipeline materials, just make sure that you put it in here as well. Otherwise it won't update. You'll wonder why it's not changing. So yeah. Yeah, there we go. Dynamic light maps, and yeah, so I hope you like that. Bit of an update on the source code engine. Cheers.